We're going to start again in the Connect section on page 234. Let's begin. Connect. Once in a while, there is a story woven into the fine threads of history that simply begs to be remembered and retold. The story I'm going to tell you is such a story. We have set the stage well for this story with our chapters about the Great War and its effects on the families of Europe. You will remember that there were several European rulers who were all grandchildren of Queen Victoria, whom we met in chapter 14 of our story. Among these leaders was the Tsar Nicholas II, who was married to Empress Alexandra, the granddaughter of Queen Victoria, thereby making him the Queen's grandson through marriage. Alexandra and Nicholas had 5 children, 4 daughters and 1 son. The youngest of the daughters was the Grand Duchess Anastasia Nikolaevna Romanov, who was born in June of 1901. Anastasia was a lively and mischievous little girl who had a quick sense of humor, a stubborn streak, sparkling blue eyes, and reddish blonde hair. She was a bright girl who loved music and learned foreign languages easily. Anastasia was a young teen when the Great War began. Throughout the years between 1914 and 1917, the family lost their prestige and popularity with many of their people. In 1917, after her father abdicated the throne, the family was sent by train to Siberia. The provisional government was now in control and placed the entire family under guard until April of 1918. At this point, the family, their 3 servants, their family doctor, and their dogs were transferred to another house in Yekaterinburg, a city in the Ural Mountains. On one dreadful night, Bolshevik supporters murdered the entire family, their servants, and even their doctor. Among rumors that stated that the Tsar was dead, but the rest of the family was somewhere safe in the United States. The true events were speculated about for nearly a decade. Finally, in 1926, the Russian government admitted to executing the entire Romanov family. Because of the secrecy surrounding the horrible event, rumors spread like wildfire. One of these rumors was centered around Anastasia. Many believed that the youngest daughter had escaped the execution and was in hiding somewhere. There were even women who came forward to claim that they were the long-lost Grand Duchess. The most famous of these impostors was Polish factory worker named Franziska Szankowska, a young woman who claimed that she was Anastasia. Because she looked similar to the murdered Grand Duchess, she convinced or confused many people. After the truth came out about her true identity, Franziska immigrated to the United States and went by the name Anna Anderson, which she changed yet again when she married. Now called Anastasia Manahan, Franziska's story was made into a movie in 1956. The main character of Anna Anderson was played by Ingrid Bergman. It was a story of intrigue about a woman who no one could prove or disprove to be Anastasia Romanoff. Throughout the following decades, more plays and movies were made depicting this mystery. Finally, in the early 1990s, after the Soviet Union collapsed, it was revealed to the world that the remains of Nicholas, his wife, the servant, and the doctor, and the 3 of the daughters, including Anastasia, had been found in 1976. The DNA tests that confirmed that it was indeed the executed royal family. The final daughter, Maria, and the 1 young son, Alexis, were found in 2007. The entire family could now rest in peace. Sometimes the stories that make up the history of our world can be so very sad. The story of the Romanov family has always been one that makes me stop and contemplate the evil of sin. I'm thankful that God will have the last say. In an earlier chapter about the Great War, I mentioned to you that the Russian soldiers did not want to fight anymore because of how they were treated. Many of them refused to fight or deserted the army. The unrest and rebellion, which was at least partly centered around having to fight in a world that they didn't feel was really about them at all, combined with the suffering under an extremely oppressive government, eventually led to the Russian Revolution of 1917. The Revolution of 1917 was the third in a series of revolutions in which the Russians had tried to shake off the control of the czars. The first one had taken place in December of 1825 and had become known as the Decembrist Uprising. This revolt was led by members of the upper class after the Tsar Alexander I died. The Decembrist uprising had been squashed by the government. The second revolt took place in 1905 after the Russo-Japanese War. The uprising did not gain any change in the government. The Russian Revolution of 1917 actually happened in two events. The first was in March of that year, when Tsar Nicholas stepped down from power and provisional government was established. A provisional government is a temporary government set up to run the country until a more permanent government is established. The second event took place in November of 1917 when Vladimir Lenin came to power as the leader of the radical Bolshevik wing of the Communist Party. It was the Bolsheviks that established a government regime that was far more severe and tyrannical than any czar had ever been. This rise to power by the Bolsheviks was not a peaceful transition. Indeed, it was a terrifying time for the Russian people. Let's take a closer look at the Russian Revolution of 1917. In March of 1917, the Russian government collapsed. Tsar Nicholas was away leading his family in the Great War, while at home in Russia there were food strikes and riots in the streets. Anti-war demonstrations were held throughout St. Petersburg. On March 15th, the Tsar abdicated, the day after a provisional government was put into place. The provisional government was made up of leaders with varying points of view. Their diversity was not a strength in this case. Some of them wanted to get out of the Great War. Others wanted to continue the war and work on domestic reform afterward. Their inability to work together and establish a firm hold on the government left the door open for the conquest from within. This is how it happened. Vladimir Lenin, the revolutionary leader of the Bolshevik Party, who had been exiled in East Switzerland, saw a chance to bring his socialist ideals to Russia. Lenin seized the opportunity. The Germans, who hoped he would make sure that Russia left the war, allowed him passage through Germany to Sweden. Lenin deftly controlled the outcome, overpowering the two other opposing governmental powers, the conservatives and the social democrats, who each wanted opposite plans for the country. Their division was the weakness that left the door open for Lenin's Communist Party. Lenin used the very things that many of the Russian people wanted: reform programs, such as worker-controlled factories, in order to gain control. Once in control, he took back the programs he had used as bait. It was a classic bait-and-switch scam, which uses the desires of the masses to bait them, only to give them exactly what they don't want as a reward. Of course, they didn't know that this was what was happening to them until it was too late. All of this was taking place between the months of March and October of 1917. In late October, the Bolsheviks staged their coup. The Russians were using an older calendar than the rest of the world. Thus, the revolutions were called the February instead of March, and October instead of November revolutions. They had already made the necessary military preparations for the governmental takeover, and within 24 hours the capital was under their control. Lenin's government moved their headquarters to the Kremlin in Moscow and began their crackdown on the people of Russia. Non-Bolshevik socialist factions were removed from all worker councils and political activities. Of course, this caused a major uproar among the socialists. And in the midst of all of the hubbub, an assassination attempt was made on Lenin. Although he did not die, he was seriously wounded. The assassination attempt brought the fury of the communist government, who proclaimed a campaign of Red Terror. The abdicated Tsar and his family were murdered at Yekaterinburg in July 16th or 17th in 1918. These were hard times for the people of Russia. In addition to the events at home in Russia, Lenin had to remove Lenin had to remove the country from the Great War. Lenin's government negotiated with the Germans, who gave them the hard choice of either handing over territory or facing the collapse of his new government. Although neither alternative was particularly acceptable, he chose to hand over the territory and sign the peace treaty at Brest-Litovsk. We learned about that treaty in the first part of this chapter. This treaty led to a civil war that lasted until 1920 between the Bolsheviks and their political opponents. Lenin and his Bolsheviks ultimately emerged victorious and officially changed Russia's name to the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics, also called the USSR and the Soviet Union for short. So we're gonna continue on and to page 238 to the map and the church history. And then you guys can look at the Siberia page on your own, which is page 240 and 241. And then once we're done with this, I'll have Miss Vicky go over more questions with you guys. So let's look at our maps, page 238. This map shows Europe and parts of the Middle East 5 years after the end of the war, after World War I. It shows how the German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman empires were divided into new countries. Some pre-existing countries, such as Romania and Serbia, gained territory. In fact, Serbia became the new country of Yugoslavia. Some of the countries that were created were pieced together from several different empires. A good example of this was Poland. Though Poland had been an independent country in the Middle Ages, it had not ruled itself or existed as an independent country since the 1700s. During that time period, it had been divided between the German, Russian, and Austro-Hungarian empires. Now, after World War I, the various pieces of Poland that had been controlled by these empires were formed into an independent country called Poland. Europe was not the only place that saw changes. The Ottoman Empire was divided into separate countries and territories too. The country of Turkey was independent, while the French and British controlled new territories called mandates. So look at the map. Which new countries that formed after World War I do you recognize? Just take a moment to look at it. So let's look at the connect. When we studied Europe in the 1800s, we learned about the concept of balance of power. Based on your reading, how do you think the end of these four empires and the many new countries formed from them affected the world's balance of power? Just something for you to think about. Let's move on to page 239, church history. We have learned that the Communist Party that took over Russia did not hesitate to do terrible things against their citizens in order to gain and maintain control. One of the Soviet Union's objectives was to eliminate religion in the country. Back in chapter 14 of our story, we learned about Karl Marx and his dream of freeing people of the crutch of religion. His political philosophy was the Bible of the Communist Party. His beliefs ignore the very important role that religion and God should play in people's lives. But these were teaching Marx's followers seized on. To accomplish this goal of removing religion from people's lives, on December 4th, 1917, the regime nationalized church property, which means they made it state property. They harassed believers and publicly ridiculed religion. Although they never actually outlawed religion, they did their best to squelch it. A week after they took the Russian Orthodox Church's land, they took control of provincial schools, establishing them as training grounds to propagate atheism. On December 18, 1917, the communist regime made marriage into a civil, not religious ordinance. They had successfully stripped the church of its official influence on the citizens of Russia. During the communist rise to power and throughout the following 2 decades, the Russian Orthodox Church continued to be the communist regime's main target for ridicule and extreme persecution. Over the following 2 years, many of the believers and almost all of the clergy were either shot to death or sent to the communist prison camps. By the end of 1930s, the communist regime had done almost everything imaginable to completely destroy the Russian Orthodox Church, including 280 bishops and 45,000 priests being murdered. Over the next 80 years, the communists continued to brutally oppress religion. Because of the actions of the Russian communists, there was a major severing of the Russian Orthodox Church from their dioceses in other parts of the world. Groups of Russian Orthodox Christians in America, Manchuria, Japan, and in European countries where refugees had fled to safety all lost regular contact with their mother church in Russia. All right, so we'll go ahead and let Miss Vicki go over questions with you, and then you may work on your worksheet and also do your timeline. So if you're wise with your time, you may be able to have all your homework done. I miss being with you guys today, and I hope to see you next week.